perfect. Okay. Inumamkima Makoam Hirimba Deham Stormy Gomez. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Stormy Gomez, and I am truly grateful to have been a part of such a grand collaboration between Isidro del Sur Pueblo's Department of Tribal Empowerment, the Student Leadership and Campus Life team at El Paso Community College, and finally the University of Texas at El Paso's College of Liberal Arts and Arise, the Academic Revival of Indigenous Studies and Education Student Organization. So the purpose of this collective effort and panel series is to awaken the people of the borderland to the indigeneity around all of us. Our region is home to Indigenous peoples on both sides of the US-Mexico border, and the celebration is aimed to recognize our struggles and triumphs as one. First, I wanted to personally thank each and every one of you who has tuned in today. If you all have a question for one or for all of the panelists, please do type it in the chat box and we will address it at the end of the discussion. Today, we're going to continue our discussion series with one titled Unapologetically Indigenous, Abandoning Stereotypes. An inclusive discussion about the misunderstandings and assumptions of being Indigenous with the help of my panelists, Skylar Gomez of Isidro del Sur Pueblo, Cheyenne Lozano, Diné Nation, Heidi Munoz, Isidro del Sur Pueblo, and Celia Aguilar, Anahuaca. To begin, our first panelist, Skylar Julius Gomez, was born and raised in El Paso, a proud Tigua native whom has graduated from UTEP and developed a passion to learn about culture, not only of his own but also of others. He plans to pursue a master's in sociocultural psychology in order to help those who may not be able to help themselves, as well as help his own community and pueblo, by sharing a platform and speaking through academic research. Welcome, Skylar. In her own words, Cheyenne Lozano was lovingly raised in a mixed household. From her mother, she gets her Navajo Manigotes clanship, and from her father, an understanding of the gray area that is El Paso, where he grew up as a Mexican American. While starting her history degree at UTEP, she worked with Dr. Shepard, the late Dr. Daly, and her close friends to form Arise, the Academic Revival of Indigenous Studies and Education, a student organization whose goals are to educate and bring awareness to the El Paso community of Indigenous communities' cultural diversity, history, and current events. She spent her college years helping to bring Indigenous voices, music, and perspectives to UTEP. Now, as an aspiring writer, she hopes to add to the growing area of Indigenous poets and authors to help break down stereotypes and include themselves in all spheres of influence. Welcome, Cheyenne. The next panelist, Heidi Munoz, was also born and raised in El Paso in the Far East. She is a member of Isidro del Sur Pueblo and has been reconnecting with her culture since 2015. She did attend New Mexico State University and graduated with her bachelor's degree in sociology. Today, she is working at the Department of Tribal Empowerment as an academic success advisor with the Impact Program, where she guides the Pueblo students into academic achievement in higher education. Welcome, Heidi. And lastly, Celia Aguilar. She is a writer, performer, and educator who uses her art to give voice to different social issues, as well as promoting and retaining her culture as both a woman of Indigenous ancestry and a fronteriza. She has been published in Mother, Madre, Mujeres de Maíz, Flor y Canto, Paso del Rio Grande del Norte, the Rio Grande Review, and Barrio Panther. She had the honor of competing in the Women of the World Poetry Slam in Dallas. Her first play, Heridas, was debuted for El Paso's 1 Billion Rising and was presented 2 consecutive years by the UNM camp students during their Farm Worker Awareness Week. She earned her Bachelor of Arts in Chicano Studies from UTEP with a minor in political science. While Celia recognizes that her experiences are different from Indigenous communities that live on reservations, those fighting for their ancestral lands and working to retain their language, she fully embraces her Indigenous roots and actively works to reclaim the identity historically taken from her and from others. Welcome, Celia. And just a side note, Celia will be gracing us with some spoken word at the end of this panel discussion, so please do stick around to listen to that. Stereotype. An often oversimplified or biased mental picture how to characterize the typical individual of a group. We are aware that stereotypes and discrimination occurs every day throughout this nation, from some schools not allowing males to have long hair to not looking native. What is a native supposed to look like? Now, for myself, growing up native in a border city, it's always raised questions in others. Questions that almost always made me find some sort of simplified way to explain that there is a pueblo in El Paso and that I do reside on a reservation here. I constantly find myself having to prove of who I am or where I am from, so much so that I've tried to steer away from even mentioning I am Indigenous. To me, it would just make it easier that way. For example, I excluded that part of my identity from my classmates during my entire undergrad at UTEP, just to avoid questions that may have followed. I eventually began to be very choosy with whom I would develop conversations with about my culture, because I knew that not all who questioned me did genuinely care, but instead they had these discriminatory assumptions about our tribe. So as I began to grow, I realized that these conversations about my race were just continuous battles of proving my existence here, and especially in a border city. And I came across, but while we were organizing our panels, I came across a video from ASU, and one student's statement has resonated with me since. So I'll go ahead and share that. He said, "Being native in a city is almost a daily reminder of your people's erasure, of the fact that you even exist." So I can definitely relate to that. And with that being said, I would now like to address my entire panel. History has taught us about the different assumptions and stereotypes imposed on Indigenous people. As an Indigenous woman, I know they are not true, because we are composed of so much greatness that is taken for granted, even by our own people. Can you each briefly give an example of an offensive term that you've been referred to as? And Skylar, I'm going to start with you and continue with Cheyenne, Heidi, and Celia.
All right, so growing up, specifically in middle school, there was a lot of students there, and even some of my friends who would refer to me as Redskin. And I understand now that the word itself is pejorative. It changes meaning over time, but during that time, it made me feel insecure. So kind of had to like suppress that side of me, change my identity and alter it so I can fit in, because when people refer to me as that, I felt marginalized and isolated and, like the odd one out. So Redskin definitely changed meaning over the past few centuries, and it is an incredibly offensive term.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing that. Cheyenne, how do you feel?
What comes to mind quickly is in middle school. I feel like that's when people start learning they can hurt you a lot better with words. Elementary school things slip out, maybe misunderstandings. I think middle school is really when people start realizing their words can hurt you. And I remember there was a boy who did say, the only good Indian is dead Indian to me. And, was one of those ones where it's like, I think he just meant it to hurt me. It still does, because it was like, wow, I didn't think something that small could affect me even now, still thinking about it, you know, because words can hurt as small as they are.
Definitely. But what we have to remember is that we survived. We survived, and we're grateful for our ancestors, and we're here to bring light to those who don't know. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. Heidi?
So for me, a common misconception that I feel like Native Americans have is that, or that people have about Native Americans, is that Native Americans like live off the government. So a term I've been referred to is like a freeloader. And so there's this notion that Indigenous people like benefit from the government, or like we have special privileges from the government, which isn't true at all. So I think a lot of people fail to realize that like Estado de Ser Pueblo is its own sovereign nation. Like we have our own government, our own leadership, and we're completely separate from the U.S. I feel like a lot of people just don't realize that.
No, they don't. They don't know, and the issue is that they won't ask us. They just make assumptions, and that's what creates this misconception for all of us. Thank you. Celia?
So I think like the most common thing that I get called, and it happens a lot, is Pocahontas, which is really, I mean, there's a lot of things wrong with that, right? It's not okay. It narrows you down to this character, a whole culture. It exoticizes you, you know? But something that I wanted to touch on briefly is kind of how sometimes our own family has these views of us. I know for me that's been an issue, and I had thinking about the stereotype of like this godless savage Indian, you know. I had my sister not explicitly tell me one day about how she was concerned. She said it with such disappointment and concern that I had strayed so far from our values and upbringings and traditions. When for me, I feel like I'm actually coming closer to our actual traditions. So I think that was something really painful to see how she views our Indigenous culture. Just wanted to mention that.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you to all of you for sharing that. Moving forward, I specifically wanted to ask Skylar this question. We know it is no secret that the federal government has attempted to apologize to Indigenous communities by paying reparations for the trauma and the colonization that was caused. What this generation has seen is the effects of the stereotypes and negativity associated with the views of reservations and specifically casino culture. Living in the borderland and being a part of the education system, what prejudices and stereotypes have you faced as an Indigenous male in the borderland?
Yeah, so this is generally the perception of us revolving around stereotypes, prejudice, and casino culture, something I've definitely experienced as well as witnessed. A lot of assumptions are made based on the Pueblo's economic conditions, coming from very poor backgrounds to now being rather prosperous. It was a reversal of bad fortune and an upset of power, definitely. Over the years, though, there have been many newspaper reports and articles from El Paso Times as well as Texas Monthly, who, if read between the lines, all wondered the same thing: why are we still upset? And it's a kind of backhand that begs the question, do people think we don't suffer from systematic oppression because we have a casino? And the casino itself is a business, and it is our business, and it is the reason why we are financially stable and how we are able to provide the rest of our community with resources and a livelihood that was almost destroyed. But that hasn't been our only business endeavor. We have made investments in convenience stores, gas stations, commercial services, as well as contracting. Despite our success in developing and running these businesses, we still run into problems not normally faced by other people. We face constant pressure and persecution from state government trying to shut down these businesses, specifically Speaking Rock. It is a constant reminder of their presence and an attempt to bring us down, but we are ready to move against the current. Like all our Indigenous family throughout the nations, we are resilient like we have always been. And change always moves at the pace of the modern world, which is exactly what we did. We adapted and still retain our tradition along the way. So when we get asked again, why are we still upset? You're doing well. Trying again to divert attention to the real issue at hand. We are not respected. So there are still people out there who refuse to acknowledge our existence, that we are not Native Americans because we have been what some people call Mexicanized, as if transculturation doesn't exist. We have adopted certain cultural aspects from our neighbors, but that still doesn't sit well with others. Despite the fact that we reside near the border, why we have adopted certain values isn't well understood. We have been labeled as mestizos with good lawyers, believing we're simply Mexican Americans pretending to be natives in order to reap the benefits of the federal government. But these are the same type of people who uphold and perpetrate stereotypes of Native American and Indigenous culture, believing that we have to fit a certain image or meet a kind of criteria, and that we have to look a certain way as well as act a certain way, which is all wrong because culture itself is much more than just the way you look. It's ideals, values, and even ontologies. It's important to be mindful because someone who is Indigenous can look like me or like Stormy or like any of the other panelists. We're all different and we're all in this together. And like many other social issues, it is not okay to make assumptions based on how someone looks. And if there is one thing that you can take from what I just said, it is that we are more than just our businesses. We are stronger than prejudices. Because first and foremost, we are Indigenous. We're Tiwa. And we are also here for you all. We are more than happy to share our knowledge and wisdom, which are some of the reasons why we are doing these panels. Because the thing about being Indigenous is that we aren't exclusive, we're inclusive. Thank you.
Unmute yourself, Stormy.
Thanks. So thank you, Skylar, for your response. I completely agree with your entire response. And the one thing that did really stick out for me was having to maybe make people understand that we do have our cultures and, like you say, adopt others because of how close in proximity we live to the border. And those who have never been to El Paso, it's really hard to explain what that's like. And but I'm glad we're here together to debunk these assumptions and these stereotypes for all of us. So I appreciate your response, Skylar. Thank you. Moving on to Cheyenne. Our stories have been misconstrued by colonized text and teachings, beginning from elementary education and continuing to higher education. Stereotypes and the false narratives of Indigenous people are taught at an early age, such as the teaching and glorification of Thanksgiving. As a woman from the Diné Nation who is living in the borderland, what does your resistance look like? And how do you preserve your identity when assimilation tries to drown your existence?
I would say, my notes, my resistance is generational. It wasn't just me. I was really lucky where I had my father, who he's Mexican American. So, there is that bloodline, you could say, but he was also someone that very much was aware of how things aren't simple. You can't say one or the other. Things aren't black and white. So growing up, he always kind of talked about the gray area of things. So if I went to school, and you mentioned, and I was told one story about Thanksgiving, how things are going, here are the rules of history, here's the rules of law. He was always there, and my mother was always there to kind of say, well, no, but yes, but here's something complicated. You can't just say something simple like that anymore. Here's more to it. And I didn't always understand it as much as a child, but it was something where I look back on it, I'm like, it did impose this idea in me, where I learned that, you can't, what the speaker before me was saying about, Tigo's falling into this horrible situation, people trying to take away their identity. Something a lot of Indigenous people, they're always dealing with these measurements of what you should be, how things should be. Someone thinks they read a book and saw a picture and this is the ideal. And I had people around me, and I made sure to try to remember in myself that that's not true. If you really want to kind of look at it, it's, when I went to UNM for a short time, there was this theory and thinking, decolonization, and I can't say I'm an expert on the ideas, but I very much stuck on to the idea of trying to break down those harmful separating theories and perspectives. And if you take those away, if we look back in history, it's like a lot of these Indigenous groups that we come from would have mixed, would have changed, would have evolved and been something completely different if America hadn't done what they did, if the European powers that be hadn't come in and told us how we should be. So with that in mind, I was very much in the mindset of, when I run into these things, when I run into something new and different, if I like the idea, well, I am perfectly allowed to learn more about it and incorporate it the way I will, because that was something I've understood to be much more in the thinking of a decolonized mindset, if that makes sense. And I think that's made it more freeing in a way when it comes to assimilation, because these things are taught. These ideas are taught to you. And if you make the effort, you can unlearn them. You can relearn these old, new, changing ideas. And in that way, you also help not just you, but whoever you run into. I've tried not being the person to say what it means to be Native, what it means to be Navajo, what it means to be Tigwa, all these rules. It's like I try not to be that person, because no one should be in charge of saying what is or isn't. It's your identity is your own, and wrapping your mind around that and making that decision to see things like that is really hard. But I think it's a step in the right direction. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Cheyenne. It's a struggle. It's a constant struggle, and you're right. There is no right or wrong way to identify yourself. It's however you feel. And it does, for me, I can agree that I think school has a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? My goodness. I guess influence on how others view us. And actually recently with one of my peers, we went to the same elementary school, so this came up in conversation. We're reflecting on how we celebrated Thanksgiving at that school, and we remembered, it's an awful memory, but we were forced to dress as pilgrims. That was our assignment. All students had to do so. That's how we celebrated our Thanksgiving luncheon. And it's a little mind-boggling because a lot of my peers were living in my reservation too, but they didn't take note to that. It was the textbook ideal way, like you said. And since that moment, I can already say that we were being taught to deny our own indigeneity according to what the education system saw we should be identifying with. So I hear you, and I appreciate your words.
I just want to add on that I think I had a weirdly lucky situation where I was maybe one of two Native people in my elementary school, maybe one of two Natives in my middle school, and I think my joke is like I felt like I was like a Where's Waldo kind of situation where instead of people, more often than not, people didn't know how to be racist to me because I was the first Native they'd run into, and that's such a weird thing because I grew up in El Paso and Antigua Reservation's right there, Mescalero's right there, but I was this unicorn, and a lot of times I took it upon myself on some ways to be a teacher. You know, I remember being in elementary school, and for Thanksgiving, I would do a presentation in front of my class to tell everyone what a Navajo was, or these ideas, or I'd go dressed up. And it was just something I've always, like my parents have helped me with, something I've always liked, and something I've carried on of like, you know, you don't know these things. And sometimes it's done out of ignorance, sometimes you do know better, but I always assumed that if I teach you something, then at least I know that, like, I tried. So that was kind of my approach in middle school, high school, and then leading up to college too, because it's like I didn't, you know, again, I had the father that would help me, and that's a horrible situation that you fell into, you know, and I think it is just lucky that I just had teachers that were more amazed that I was Native and they didn't know how to deal with it than even stepping up to the plate to be racist sometimes because they were just so caught off guard of like, wow, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. Cheyenne, do you want to step out of the room while we discuss like early history because like we don't want to upset you, you know?
Yes.
It was just a completely different situation, you know, but then I hear stories like that with yours and other places. I'm just, you know, it's a problem both ways in the system because neither one of these situations are being taught, you know, in a perfect way, and getting that early on issues at a young age, those faults in the elementary, middle school system is what leads to people still having issues and being surprised in college, you know, of, you know, having those epiphanies, and it's like that shouldn't happen. This is a group of people that are important to the United States, to the Americas, and it isn't till way later in life do you realize that they're more than just a picture book, you know.
Exactly. Thank you. Speaking of other perspectives, Heidi grew up outside of the reservation. So I would like to ask you, Heidi, you are somewhat away from interacting with people in your nation, and sometimes our own people hold a stigma towards those who didn't grow up in the reservation, and they began integrating themselves as an adult. Can you share with us what drove you to reconnect to your people and the Pueblo?
Okay, so growing up, like outside of the reservation, I wasn't aware about like my own culture till about, I say, high school. And then I knew that I was an Indigenous person, but I had no connection to the tribe, so I knew nothing about my culture. And then after high school, I joined Target Tigua AmeriCorps, and it's a program here with the tribe that has like different focus areas that are designed to um, I guess educate the community about like different things, right? And so being in this position, I was a nation building trainer. Nation building, you had to really teach about like the history, culture, and the community. So here I was like completely clueless to all this information, and I was soon gonna have to like teach it to other people. So I was all frazzled. So that caused me to really like dive in and like really research like the history as much as I could, because you can only find so much on the internet. So most of it was when I was like in AmeriCorps, like from talking to like different people working there, and that was where I got like most of the information. And then, just like you said, Stormy, how sometimes our own people hold a stigma towards those who didn't grow up in the reservation. I sort of felt that even something like so trivial as saying like my culture, like my tribe, that was hard for me in the beginning. But that's something I definitely worked up to. And I think that came from like within myself being afraid of the judgment I was going to get from the more established tribal members. And so I really resonate with that. And maybe it was a case of like imposter syndrome, but I felt like every time I participated in like a community event, um, it was like more harsh faces than welcoming faces. So that like really was off-putting for me. And at first I would think that, well, maybe it's like in my head, right? Maybe it's like my own projections of not knowing like my culture, like being put out, like I'm putting it out. But then at one of the community events, I kind of heard something, like I overheard someone say something about like exactly what I was thinking. So that like really turned me off. And then, but anyways, my point was that even like with the thousands of stereotypes of Native Americans, like in everyday society, like in the media, history, books, it could even be within the people in your community. So, like in the end, I don't even know what I'm saying, but yeah.
Thank you so much. I totally hear where you're coming from. Whether we realize we're doing it or not, we can be subconsciously racist or discriminative, and your experience with integrating yourself back into the Pueblo only validates for myself and hopefully for others that we shouldn't shun those who, especially those of our own Pueblo who are looking to become more involved. We need to welcome them, share them our knowledge, and maybe answer questions that they may have, because we need to see more welcoming faces, like you said. So thank you for that. And Celia, I would like to ask you, how would you describe your experience of growing up detribalized, meaning not having a geographic location that is home to your indigeneity? Share with us your continuous fight for the reclaiming of that indigeneity and your stand on being unapologetically Indigenous in a Eurocentric and capitalist society.
First of all, thank you. And Osimilwitiwak Anotoka Celia Aguilar. Good afternoon. My name is Celia Aguilar. I want to thank all the panelists for sharing. You know, I feel, honestly, I had my reservations to be a part of the panel because I feel almost a little bit inadequate because I have such a different experience. But I also feel like the spectrum of indigeneity experience is so wide, you know. We all have our different experiences. That doesn't make us any more or any less Indigenous. And I do want to acknowledge the fact that I grew up as Mexican American, as this mistake that was always called by these Indigenous roots, right? And I know that there has been a conversation among people of, well, you're not Native American, you have Native American ancestry. And so I want to acknowledge and respect that I had this different upbringing and that I came into my Indigenous identity later in life. It was actually, it's been really, really difficult. I've had this struggle for years and years, kind of trying to prove to myself and to others. And I think that that's kind of been a recurrent theme here, is having to prove yourself, you know. And I just have had a lot of like anger and pain because I was never given the opportunity to really know who my people are, what my traditions are, what our language is. And so that's something that, I've made a commitment to research further and to honor my ancestors in that way, to continue to keep our culture alive. And something that's beautiful to me about that is that culture is living, like I feel like I kind of have this, like I'm stuck in the past, like I wish that I could have lived through this, I wish I could understand and know it, but I'm living it now. Like it lives through us in our bloodlines, in our hearts, in our spirit, and we're able to follow the traditions and the ways that are taught to us now by our elders. And so I've always kind of had that, like, that struggle, and I still feel, and the poem that I'll share later kind of touches on how difficult it's been to not be able to say, this is who I am. But ultimately, I chose to be a part of this panel because there are so many of us that this identity was taken from us. But we have made the conscious choice to reclaim it and keep it alive. And I wanted to leave the space open for the Indigenous community to be able to share their stories and talk about their experiences. And I realized that we also deserve a space to have these conversations because we are reclaiming that indigeneity, and it's not a bloodline, it is who we are, and it is how we represent ourselves, it is how we interact with the people around us, how we honor the elements and the directions, and just all of these little things that, I've always had so many questions, but ultimately I know that the answers lie within me, and that's part of being unapologetically Indigenous, right? It's not allowing anybody to tell me what I'm not, and to practice the things that make me Indigenous, to practice the things that honor my ancestors. And it's been really difficult because I'm the only person in my family that really embraces this identity. I mentioned my sister earlier. She's very assimilated, she's like super high Hispanic. She makes this clear distinction of the past, like, well, that was them, that's not me. And I feel like it's been really different for us because even in terms of like phenotype, right? This face don't lie. Like I get asked all the time what I am, and so I've been able to embrace that. Whereas a child, I used to get made fun of. People would call me India. And now it's like, yeah, Ike, like I am, and I embrace that. So I want to say thank you for allowing me to have this space and to be a part of this panel, even though my experiences are so much different. But they also mirror so many other people out there who are also reclaiming. And I just want to say how important it is that I totally feel like somebody said imposter syndrome. I totally feel that all the time, right? But it's not that I'm claiming something. I'm not trying to be a part of a nation or a tribe to get any kind of benefits or even like a lot of people who are a part of these communities in Mexico, that they have these languages that they've been fighting to keep alive. And it's kind of overshadowed by this larger culture of people who are trying to like learn Nahuatl or practice things that are kind of general, right? It's almost like we're just like grasping for things to be able to continue these traditions, but I don't want to disrespect that in any way, because our intentions are there. Our intentions are to connect to the earth and to spirit and with our other relatives, you know. So I just wanted to say that. I don't know if that answered your question, but I know that I rambled and I said something. So thank you.
Thank you. You did not ramble. Thank you so much for sharing. You are super courageous to have done so too and agreed to this panel. And I'm glad you're here. And you might feel like your perspective is totally different or you grew up differently, but we all have similarities here. And I feel like one similarity that we can share is that we're using our knowledge and our identities to educate others who don't know. And we shouldn't take offense to it when it's our opportunity to educate. And I feel like you sticking to your word and sticking to yourself is more powerful than anything. And you're doing it for yourself despite your family's disagreements or maybe misunderstandings. So awesome job, Celia. And lastly, I believe we do have time. With all the information that you all shared, what advice can you give your younger selves about being unapologetically Indigenous? And I'll begin with Skylar once again.
I would definitely tell my younger self not to hide or be discouraged. You know, be proud because you come from such a rich culture. And I would tell myself, don't whisper now. You're allowed to be loud. Thank you.
Thank you, Skylar. Cheyenne?
I'd almost want my younger self to talk to me, because I used to, when I was younger, I used to like dress up all the time, and I had such a pride in it. And I wouldn't say I don't do it now, but nowadays I've gotten lazy, and it's like, oh, I don't want to carry all that heavy jewelry and wear this long dress and all this stuff. But I think if I could, I think when I was really small, I did kind of fall into I didn't really understand the blood quantum stuff. I did fall into that when I was young. And there were times I never ran into many kids, but you know, there would be someone that would come up to me and say, well, I'm oh so much something, oh so much something. And in the back of my head I'd be like, well, you know, I've got half, you know, I've got that pride about me. And I think I tell myself, you know, that doesn't really matter. If you put that little piece of blood on a piece of paper, it's not going to turn into a little pie graph. You know, it's things are a lot more complicated than that. And the earlier you learn that, the better it is for you in the future, because it became an issue for me later of like, oh no, I'm only half compared to someone that's more, or something like that. You know, that all that energy I wasted worrying about blood quantum, it's not necessary, you know.
You're right. And earlier last week, we spoke about blood quantum on here because it can be very tricky and it's very limiting and oppressive to having to literally use numbers to measure our identity. So I'm glad we strayed away from that. But thank you so much. And I wish to have met your younger self too. Heidi?
Let's see. I think I would tell myself to really hold my like identity and my indigeneity within myself, and not so much focus on like what other people are thinking and like trying to hide it. So I really embrace it and just hold it within myself, like with more pride for sure.
Awesome. Thank you.
I think I would just kind of ask those questions in terms of when I was younger, I always felt, like I mentioned, I felt really drawn to this Indigenous aspect of my roots. And there's a lot of little things like certain methods of healing or different little things that my grandma would do, like limpias or certain things that come from her mother that were passed down through generations. And so I wish I would have asked more questions, you know, ask the why, ask the how, ask the who. And especially when I had my grandparents living, I feel like I missed out a lot because you're kind of a part of assimilation, and you know, socio-political reasons we've been detached from our Indigenous identities, right? So you don't want to be associated. Like I told my mom one time, we had this at work. I had a questionnaire for work, and they asked my race, and I was like, I don't know, man. I'm literally the only thing I think was human, and I'm like, well, I mean, I'm Mexican ancestry, but that's not a race. Or like, no, you would be white, and I was like, no, just put Native American. And so I told my mom about that, and she was like, I know, white. Like, there's this like, you don't want to be Indian, you want to be white, you know. So I would say, don't be ashamed of that, and dig deeper into it, you know, and embrace it.
Yes, 100%. There was a comment from Brenda, I saw, that she 100% agrees with you in asking your grandmother more. And those are things that are just, you know, unfortunate that we realized that too late. And I feel like now more than ever, we need to just do our best to conserve and grasp and be proud and loud of everything that we can be. So thank you all so much. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, like, I feel like there's so many things that we take for granted that we should be asking these questions, you know?
Yes. I'm going to move on to thank you everyone. I'm going to move on to the questions before we get to Celia's poetry. Okay, so there's one question that reads, scrolling up. I'll just begin with the beginning with some comments. And you all feel free to chime in. Media in Hollywood have ingrained the idea of how different races should look like, talk, or act, and it has hurt our society and how we perceive each other. Sometimes Indigenous people concede, use stereotype images, or cheer for Native mascot teams. What is your reaction to this? And can you educate Indigenous youth and tribal citizens to the long-term harms caused by stereotypes? Does anyone want to answer that question?
I think I can start. You know, I feel like that's a tough one because I've been to like powwows and stuff like that where people have these shirts and they're trying to reclaim it. You know, they'll have the Washington teams on their shirt, or they'll have the Chiefs or whatever, you know, and it's this kind of reclamation. And I've heard people talk about that. It's like, well, you know, instead of making it hurt me, I'll take it and own it as my own, you know. And part of me, I don't like telling other people how they should or shouldn't act sometimes when it comes to things like that, because like if that's something that empowers you to be more proud of being an Indigenous person, then I'm not going to say you're wrong. But I know I've just been taught, just I'm not for it personally. You know, I think too many times there can be an awkwardness. When I went to Austin High School, one time we played a game against Isleta, and I was part of the student council, and we were doing the posters for the game, and I had to stop everyone because the teacher had already written out all these posters that say "Beat the Indians," you know, and I was like, no, can't do that. That's, you know, I was lucky enough that I was in the student council to stop them from doing that. But it's like, how many times has that happened already? And you know, I know that the school's got a pride about it, and there's like, I've heard about these agreements with the tribe on it, but I remember when I went to the school and I saw these posters, these images, and you know, home of the Indians and stuff like that. It was just such an awkward feeling, and I feel like if someone doesn't have someone to talk to about that, it can have an effect on your perspective, on your point of view, and that's just for an Indigenous person. That's not at all thinking about a non-Indigenous person seeing these images and thinking they're okay, and that's the only idea you have, you know, because it's their part. That's part of the issue. Is like, it's not just. I mean, I think it's really important to think about how these images and stereotypes affect a young person's perspective on themselves, but it's also this projection to everyone that's non-Indigenous, and it's the only image they have, and it just feeds itself. You know, I feel like it's something that really needs to be dealt with, and the nuances of the discussion just aren't being handled, and oh, yeah.
Thank you so much. I agree. It's a cycle that is really tough to break if one thing leads to another, and there are many, many missing pieces to that. Thank you for addressing that question. The next question is for all of you, whoever is up to answering. How do you think we can step into our Indigenous power without falling into victimhood?
I think I would like a little more clarification about the victimhood.
Okay. In the meantime, we could move on to the next one. Thank you. What advice would you all offer individuals seeking to reclaim and reconnect with their indigeneity, especially if these nations are not easily geographically accessible, while maintaining respect for the nation to not be entitled to their knowledge or presume shared identity?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? My apologies, I missed it.
Oh, yes, no problem. What advice would you all offer individuals seeking to reclaim and reconnect with their indigeneity, especially if these nations are not easily or geographically accessible, while maintaining respect for the nation to not be entitled to their knowledge or presume shared identity?
I think that that's something that is, I mean, I feel like I'm kind of on that process, right? And you just have to be really respectful about, respectful to other nations, right? You're not trying to claim anything. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not trying to claim anything that I'm not, but I'm not gonna deny who I am. So there's also having that respect, acknowledgement of the original peoples from your land, but also, you know, I feel like you can talk to your family, you can do research on your own family history, the locations where family originates from, which is kind of like what I'm doing. I know a friend who also ended up through his research, like academic research, ended up finding his relatives in New Mexico, which I thought was really beautiful. So I think sometimes when you have that intention and you have that prayer that your ancestors guide you in that way, you have to be really resourceful. And I've had this like I wanted to mention it earlier too, where I've had this kind of conflict within myself, wanting to respect other people, but also wanting to claim my indigeneity. And I've talked with elders about it before, and they've always been very reassuring to me, you know. The abuela and the aunties are like, you know, there's people who grow up in their culture and they don't practice this and they don't honor it, but you're here. And so being able to have these conversations with people while maintaining that respect I think is something that's really important. And also looking into your own family and having those conversations and doing that research.
Thank you, Celia. There's a comment for you from Stephanie. It reads that she is extremely grateful to learn from your perspective and everything you're saying, as well as that your story is so authentic, and especially the process involved with the differences between you and your family. So thank you for that again.
Thank you.
And back to question 2 about the victimhood. It was clarified for us. So victimhood meaning believing in things like blood quantum, purity of one's race, whiteness is better, etc. Therefore, victimizing our own because they are not blank enough for ourselves because we don't know enough or speak a language.
You know, I feel like I think I understand. It was talking about having something about showing your Indigenous pride, power in relation to victimhood, correct? Or
Yes,
not
power.
falling into that. I think educating yourself on those issues, it means a lot. You know, I think it's a process sometimes, you know, because these things aren't taught in school. You know, you might not hear about blood quantum, you only know about it, and then it isn't until you learn about it do you understand the issues with it, the history of it. You know, I think when you want to have this, when you fall into like activism, showing that pride and stuff like that, I think slowly you just start learning a lot, and just being open to learning, and I think being open to not putting down people, instead raising up each other, right? I feel like a lot more good can be done by seeing the betterment and the goodness in others than focusing on what separates you, what makes you different. You know, even though it might be, like I said, when I was younger, I used to kind of fall into the blood quantum stuff. I used to think, wow, I'm more native, that gives me something. But I think that kind of came from moving from Arizona, coming to El Paso, and being the only native, thinking this kind of unicorn status of, wow, you're native, that's what makes you different and special. You know, I got that, and then I went to UNM, and all of a sudden I was around Navajos that were like, wow, you're only a half, you don't look Navajo. And it was this big culture shock to me. Whoa, this is horrible. I hate this feeling, you know, and instead of, you know, I could have been the person to be awful and mean toward others, but I don't. Why spread that anger? Why spread that hate? You know, when I could instead, like when I created the Arise group, I didn't want to focus on blood quantum. I didn't want to focus on people that clearly had a piece of paper that said, I am blank, I am this. It's like, no, if you have an interest, if you're learning, like that's been said by everyone, you know, you just, it's an effort, and everyone should be appreciated for this travel, this journey they're going on to learn more about themselves. And you make a lot more friends, and you're a lot happier person thinking about it in that way, I think, than these kind of harsher, darker realities. Knowing that they're out there helps, but in your own mindset, trying to change it and think about it in a much more positive way, I think just helps you better.
Thank you so much. I feel like looking at it with a positive light really helps, especially how you said you will become happier because you're more true to yourself, and I agree.
Yeah, I hope that answered the question. I'm not sure.
No, it did. Thank you. Thank you so much. There aren't any more questions, but there's a comment for you all. Thank you for sharing your stories. I'm grateful for your insights and participation in these panels, as well as thank you for addressing that. As a person of Mexican origin, living here for almost 20 years, it is always at the forefront on both sides of the border. Celia, would you like to share your poem with us?
Sure. So this poem is kind of explains a lot about how I've been feeling for a long time, and these questions that I've been getting. Let me try to put it up. I wasn't even ready with that. Sorry, give me a sec. Also kind of wanted to mention, like adding on to the last question, I think at a certain point, you don't really need to prove your indigeneity to anybody. I mean, first, you don't want to be, disrespectful or arrogant in a way. There's there, at least for me, there came a point where I was like, this is who I am, and I don't need to prove that to anyone, but myself and my connection with spirit, and that's all that's important. I am opening this up. Sorry, my computer's a little slow. I titled this Historical Trauma. I constantly get asked what I am. You look Yaqui. You could easily be Pueblo. With your hair like that, you look Toltec, Samoan, Pocahontas. Really? I'm Mexican. My ancestors, original inhabitants of these lands, these stolen lands, raped lands, my people's history is not recorded. It's erased, disappeared, like my people. But I long to say I'm Achichi, Zacateco, Purepecha, Apache, Charitari, Raramuri. But all I can say is, I'm of this earth. My birth certificate says I'm white, but we've never been treated as such, and I've never been confused for one. They've tried to disappear us through categories in the census, history books, and museum exhibits. Behind the barrel of a gun. Textbooks make it seem like natives are extinct. Mayans are of the past, but they still exist. In Mexico, Michigan, mines and minefields and fields of produce, and maybe we don't know our names. We still remain dark-skinned, warrior blood, healers, children of the sun, planters of corn, protectors of the water, keepers of tradition and ancient medicine, burning copal, smudging with sweetgrass and sage, building altars to hold our offerings. We are offerings, sacred elements, guardians, suffering from amnesia, so I long to say who I am, and all I can say is everything, connected to cosmos through carbon composition, celestial dust and four elements, my soul, the fire of hearth and home, my organs made of life-giving water, my cells feeding off the air that sustains, my body, earth from the earth, all lives within me, connected by a series of atomic strings. Who I am a universal light being, surviving through blood memory. Thank you. I wanted to make one quick comment about just like blood quantum and all of these ways how we've always had to try to prove our indigeneity, and that's something systematic, you know, because we have been tried to be erased for such a long time that it still continues, and we're even doing it to ourselves now. And so that's part of being unapologetically Indigenous, is to claim that, you know, with all of respect and with your knowledge, you know. Yeah, thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Celia. That was incredibly beautiful. Thank you. Very, very powerful. And everyone is going crazy in the comments. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for sharing. And actually, Yadira opened up the microphones for any viewers who would like to speak to one of the panelists or make a comment. It's open up.
I'm going to go ahead and thank each and every one of you for your vulnerability, for your stories, for your truth, for actually looking and acknowledging and voicing, you know, the mistakes that you may have made along the way and how you came back to yourself. So that was a very moving discussion from all of you. Thank you for all of your stories, for your personal stories, for, you know, things that, as you, Cheyenne, mentioned, that you brought in and still really hit you because they kind of stay with you. You know, they say that sticks and stones may break our bones, but words don't hurt us, when in reality, words, you know, as it has mentioned in previous panels, the way we use the language kind of molds the way we behave. So having those words stick with you it's proof that we need to be mindful of how we speak about each other and to ourselves. So thank you so much for all that you shared. It's really moving, and from the bottom of my heart, los aprecio mucho. Muchas gracias por sus comentarios.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you very much. And if no one has any questions for the panelists, I just wanted to thank you all again for sharing time out of your day and being supportive of this. This is just a huge step forward for all of us. And I'm glad that we got to do this for the second year around, and I hope it continues year after year. And as long as we stick together, we're gonna keep on keeping on debunking these stereotypes and assumptions that are made of us, as long as we stay true to ourselves. And I hope that you all can join us for the rest of the week. Our panels do end on Friday, so we have 3 more. And if you all have any questions for the panelists, at the very end, you can leave them in the comments. Thank you so much.